Let me switch gears a little bit. You were just at the Libertarian conference in Washington. I almost went to that. I was in New York the whole week before, and I almost went because Trump was there, and RFK Jr. was there, and of course the Libertarians were there. Vivek Ramaswamy was there. It just didn't work out logistically, but you were there because you are actually a self-identified Libertarian. And I have found over the years, because I've always had a lot of Libertarians in my audience, and there are a lot of people who try and figure out what label applies to me, and they often pick Libertarian, and sometimes they pick far left, and sometimes they pick far right, everyone, but Libertarian's one of them. And I have come to see for a long time ago that word means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, including people who claim the label. What does it mean to you?
Well, to me, being a libertarian, I mean, fundamentally, it believes, like philosophically, in the belief that in self-ownership, that human beings own themselves, that you have a better claim to yourself than any other human ever will. It believes that we believe in the non-aggression principle, meaning that it is morally justified to defend yourself with violence, but it is never morally justified to initiate violence against peaceful people, and a belief in private property rights, and which is in keeping with non-aggression. So that's what it means to me. Now, more broadly speaking, I think that I became a libertarian from the Ron Paul presidential campaign in 2008. So I was an anti-war leftist before that. And then I just thought Ron Paul was like a better anti-war voice than any leftist I had ever heard. And I was interested in the fact that he, was so passionately committed to like laissez-faire capitalism that seemed wrong to me. But he sparked my interest enough that I was like, I want to read this guy's books and then read every book he recommends so I can kind of figure out what the flaw in this theory is. And ultimately, as I fell down this rabbit hole of reading libertarian books, I was just converted. I was convinced. And so to me, libertarianism is the belief in like laissez-faire free markets, peace, non-interventionism, and the idea of free speech, free assembly, the right to, be innocent until proven guilty, basic core principles like that. That's what I would describe libertarianism as.
So there are a lot of countries, you could include the United States, but there are certainly countries where it's far worse, where the level of economic inequality is so great that not only is it causing immense amounts of human suffering from people who don't have access to clean water or sewage or healthcare or basic education and all of that, that not only is it causing a huge amount of deprivation for a significant portion of the country, if not all of it, but it's also doing what the founders warned about, who of course were not communists but capitalists, namely that if you allow economic inequality to become too extreme, eventually it will spill over into the political realm, and it will endanger the idea of political liberty as well, or equality of political rights as well. And of course, you see that now in a lot of countries like the United States, where obviously the people who are extremely rich have maybe 90% of the influence in how the laws are enacted and who ends up in office, and the 10% of the people, or rather 10% of the richest do, and the 90% of the people don't. Are there circumstances where there is so much suffering in the country and where the level of economic inequality is so great that you would favor certain kinds of state intervention to alleviate them even in the short term?
Probably not. But I just, to be very specific here, right? I just want to say, and I'm not like just being pedantic. I just want to be like very clear. I don't think that this is something I used to believe, but that I was convinced out of in these days that I was mentioning. But I don't actually think inequality, economic inequality, is necessarily a problem. So, for example, let's say if the poorest Americans today got 50% richer and the middle class got 50% richer, but that came with the rich getting 500% richer, I would not think of that as a negative thing, even though it would increase inequality or income inequality, because I'd go, oh, everybody's getting richer. This is fine. I think one of the dynamics that's very bizarre this is true beyond the United States of America, but particularly in America, is that while you'll have, often we'll have these kind of like political theoretical debates between, say, like a right winger and a left winger. They'll kind of be like a Ben Shapiro type against a Bernie Sanders type. And the Ben Shapiro type, will say that he believes in free markets or something like that. And then the Bernie Sanders type will say that he believes in redistribution from the rich to the poor. And then there'll be an argument between them, whatever, about like, well, I think free markets actually help everybody. And then he'll say, well, no. There are these wealthy people. We should take some of their money and then give it back to the people who don't have as much money. But in reality, in the world that we actually live in, what we have is a system of redistribution from the poor and working and middle class to the politically connected elite class. This is just like undeniably the case across the board, not even in the most blatant examples of like, say, just like corporate welfare and handouts to corporations. If you just want to look in like over the last 4+ years, there's been the biggest transfer of wealth in human history, and it's gone from the working and middle class to the politically connected billionaire class. So number one, we all should be together in opposing that. But I mean, even in policies like, say, something like Social Security, where the group paying in are young new workers and they're paying out retired people who are a much wealthier class than new workers. Or if you just look at something like, say, artificially low interest rates that we've had over the last decade, who does that benefit? Well, it doesn't benefit people on a fixed income. It doesn't benefit people who have been saving their money. It benefits speculators and people on Wall Street. Or if you look at, say, like just the way that we're printing money and then handing it off to the military industrial complex or the pharmaceutical industrial complex, and they kind of get the new money when it still has the same value. And then we see prices soaring and everybody in the middle and lower classes loses their purchasing power. So look, in theory, your question about would I ever support a government intervention? I mean, I don't know. I'd have to to see what the scenario is. But what I see in the real world is that governments are essentially these power centers that are set up, that are, as George Carlin pointed out, that are essentially ruled over by private interests. And this becomes the tool to extract money from the rest of us to make these private interests more wealthy. And that is something that I think, whether you're a libertarian or a leftist or anywhere in between, really, we should all object to.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think even if you are a fan of capitalism, it's very hard to argue that what we have in the United States is anything resembling capitalism, since the government is constantly intervening in the free market, only usually to help the very people who are financing their campaigns, who are the richest people, who are most important to their political. So it's kind of a crony capitalism at best. I just want to press you a little bit on this one more time, though, because I've talked to a lot of libertarians over my time, as I said. I know a lot of libertarians. And whenever I ask them this question, I get a sort of similar answer than the one that you just gave, which I think makes perfect sense theoretically, abstractly, intellectually, which is namely that the reason there's so much suffering on the part of the poor and the people who are this deprived is because the system itself needs a reconstruction. It needs to be kind of broken down and recreated so that there's more of a kind of pure free market where the government's not constantly involved in free market. But I'll just give you this short anecdote, this little story that happened. Here in Brazil, where as bad as poverty is in the United States, it's often in a different universe. I mean, really, you go to neighborhoods, there is no clean drinking water, there's no education, it is a poverty. But actually in the United States, people are now starting to face that kind of thing too. They're sleeping on the streets in bigger numbers, large families, et cetera. And I remember my husband and I did an NGO that was designed to kind of bring services to the poorest places in Rio de Janeiro that would give education systems, give support things that the state isn't providing. And when the left found out that a lot of this was funded, we got funders from very wealthy people, they started attacking us and saying, oh, this is a libertarian solution. And this is something the state should be doing. And what we need is to work for this kind of idealistic socialism or a deconstruction of society. And eventually we'll have the right system in place that doesn't produce this level of poverty. And my view of it was, well, that is wonderful. And maybe in 30 years from now, we'll have either a libertarian nirvana or a socialist nirvana where this doesn't happen anymore. But in the meantime, there's extreme amounts of suffering that come from economic inequality. And so is there some moral or even economic rationale that would justify the state saying we're going to create some programs, not to redistribute wealth, but that to provide the most deprived people in our society at least some elevation so they have some equal opportunity, they're not dying of treatable diseases, they're not malnourished, etc. In the interim, while you're building whatever system you think will solve that.
Well, again, though, I just think that, first of all, those problems don't come from inequality. Those problems come from extreme poverty. And I do think that that's important to distinguish. Like, again, if I make $100,000 a year and someone else makes $100 million a year, that is more like inequality than if somebody makes $100 a year and the richest person makes $1,000 a year. And that's you know what I mean? So like the problem isn't necessarily the gap. The problem is how poor the poor are. Now, look, I mean, in the example you just used and the one that popped into my mind, and I don't remember this story precisely off the top of my head, but there was a guy in California, I believe, who was making the like tiny homes for homeless people and found a way to like produce a whole bunch of them so like he could give homeless people these small homes. And the government came in and shut it down because they said they weren't up to code. And so even in your example, it's like, look, I just believe that by its very nature, the government is an instrument of force, and that the way it works is that they are a violent monopoly who is going to say that we have, you know what I mean? Like we have a monopoly on this service, and if you mess with that, we will kill you or throw you in prison. That is the nature of government. Whether everything about government has a gun pointed to your head, hidden right behind it. Even just something like the income tax. Like we all pay it, but we all kind of pay it because it's like you could go to jail. Your life could be ruined by violence. You could be enslaved if you don't pay this. And I just fundamentally don't believe that that's the tool that's going to solve these problems. And so, look, again, if you're saying that, I think there's almost like a contradiction for people who advocate for government policies where you're saying that, like, look, well, if human beings aren't good enough to just help the least amongst us, don't you think that the government should come in and just force them to? Which I kind of understand on one level, but the flaw in that thinking to me is that, well, who's the government made up of? It's also made up of human beings. I think oftentimes people think of state actors as if they're somehow above the rest of us, whereas in reality, we know that politicians and political cronies are like the worst human beings on the planet. And so if human beings aren't good enough to help the least amongst us, then I don't think we can rely on the most corrupt human beings to force the rest of us at the threat of violence to help the least amongst us. Essentially what I'm saying is that I think we'll be much better off for many of the goals that you value, which I also value. I think we'll be much better off allowing human beings to freely, voluntarily interact and come up with solutions for these things, which I think even your example was you and your late husband making an attempt to do so.
All right, yeah, just to be clear, those questions were not necessarily my views. I wanted to hear you confront some of what I think are the strongest arguments against libertarianism. Last question on this before we move to the much lighter and easier topic, which is Israel and Gaza and related questions. Is there a country that you can point to in recent history where that kind of a model has been implemented and worked? And do you think the possibility exists that Milei in Argentina will be a person who will strive to do that?
Well, to the first question, no. And to your I mean, I guess I should give a little bit more than that. I would say that I think to the degree that freedom has been tried, I think it's been overwhelmingly successful. And I think that there's never been a country that's as free as I'd like to see it. I know there might be some libertarians or anarchists who will argue with me about like ancient Ireland was really an anarchist society or something like that. But I would say that, in the same way, like if I was advocating that nobody should murder anybody and nobody should rape anybody, you could say, well, give me an example of a society where there's been no murder or no rape. And yeah, okay, I probably can't give you an example of that, but I am just arguing that it would be a better world if we could cut down on that as much as possible. I would say that on the spectrum of freedom to totalitarianism, whatever that would be, like pure freedom versus pure totalitarianism, that, yeah, I think you could look at, say, a few examples where there was like a common culture and a common geographical location and a common tradition, like, West Germany versus East Germany during the Cold War, or North and South Korea, or Hong Kong and China. Even the United States of America, I think, became the most powerful country in the world because it had a greater degree of liberty than most other places.
But it's still not like a 71% tax rate at the time of like what people consider to be its heyday, like in the middle of the century. And
yeah, I mean, look, if you look at even in, I think there was a 90% tax rate on the top marginal rates before that. But even then, if you go look at the effective tax rate, it's right around the same as it is now. I mean, a lot of that was largely symbolic. If you go, I don't have the numbers in front of me now, but it would be like, I'm sure people paying over 300 or earning over $300,000 a year had to pay that, but no one was really earning that. I was literally just talking to my father-in-law about an hour ago before I came down to do this show, and he was talking about how he was making $35,000 a year, or he was making $30,000 a year and bought his first home for $35,000 in the 70s. So if you're talking about in the 1960s, what the rate was for people making over $300,000 a year, it just, nobody was really making that except like the uber rich. And they always have an army of accountants and tax lawyers who get them out of actually paying what they're supposed to pay. But if you're talking about America, say, but in what built its heyday, like when we became the industrial superpower of the world, we didn't have an income tax at all. We didn't have a central bank. We didn't have federal regulation. Now, I know I'm not trying to like pretend that this was like a libertarian society. It certainly wasn't. And certainly for different groups, it was much less than it was for others. I'm just making the point that I think to the extent that laissez-faire free markets that have been tried, they've been very successful compared to other areas at the time. Also, I think there are, you can look at different experimentations that have happened, say in Portugal with drug laws, things like this, where it's been much more successful to say not fight a war on drugs, but to just say like, hey, we're going to allow people to do what they want to do. So I do think there are examples where it's been successful. What was your second question? I'm sorry. First was,
it was about Argentina and Milei. What if you think that they are headed toward?
Yes. So I do not know nearly enough about Milei and Argentina to have an educated perspective on this. I would say that he, some of his positions, particularly on Israel and Ukraine, like foreign policy stuff, I have really not liked. I think that from what I understand, there have been real drastic cuts in many areas of government. And I do tend to think that this is going to work out well. I really just don't know enough. I also do think that as much as, and you know me, Glenn, I mean, as much as some of the foreign policy stuff he's talking about just makes my skin crawl, I go, look, maybe the guy's like a CIA plant or something like that. Or maybe if you're the president of Argentina, you got to really make sure you don't piss off the United States of America. Like maybe you just got to say whatever you got to say when it comes to foreign policy, because look, he's not the commander-in-chief of the empire. He's just the president of Argentina.
Right.
So,
although you would think, I do think he's part of this far right that has become very enamored of Israel. I mean, Bolsonaro, the first thing he did upon getting elected in Brazil was ran to Israel. Geert Wilders in the Netherlands has a big, gigantic Israel flag. Milei actually wrapped himself in the flag. I think it's more a kind of culture war issue, but I get it. And before I want to just move on to Israel, but I don't want to belabor the point because I think you did a great job of describing, for maybe people haven't heard it before, under a little bit of questioning, like exactly what the libertarian worldview is. But just on that Portugal example you mentioned, and the only reason why I mentioned it is because I actually went to Lisbon in 2008 to do the first study on the success of Portuguese decriminalization of all drugs, and it was an extraordinary success. The reason it was an extraordinary success is because once they stopped using the money that they had been using to arrest and investigate and prosecute and imprison drug users, they shifted all of that money instead to things like drug counseling programs and clean needles and the like. And in the United States, there have been a couple of cities that had tried Portuguese decriminalization. I think Portland was one of them, and it turned out to be a disaster. And the reason is because they took away they did decriminalization, but then never put the resources into those kind of programs that help get addicts off the street. But anyway, I think it's a super interesting question. I wish there was a lot more inclusion of libertarian ideology, but as we're seeing with RFK, not involved in this Bush-Trump debate, even though he's the most successful third-party or independent candidate in decades. The system is designed to ensure that those views do not get hurt. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.